So I'm at the National Salt Satyagraha Memorial at Dandi, and this memorial has a number of different components, and one of those is a set of murals or frescoes. I think they're about 24, something like that, such murals here. And this is the mural which takes us to the events of April 6th, 1930, very early in the morning, about 6:05 a.m. when Gandhi broke the salt law. But before we get to this, let's go back to the letter that Gandhi addressed to the Viceroy at that time, Lord Irwin, a letter in which he set out to describe what he proposed to do. Now, this letter, as I pointed out before, is an extraordinarily unusual letter in the annals of political history. I dare say that no such letter has ever been written before by anyone, certainly not someone who was the subject of an empire and was writing to the colonial overlord. In this letter, what Gandhi sets out to do is to explain the circumstances that are going to lead him to break the salt law. Now, when did we ever hear of a revolutionary whose plan is to inform his opponent of what he proposes to do beforehand, and to invite the opponent, in this case the colonial government, the government of British India, to arrest him? Because what he tells Lord Irwin is that he's going to set out on such and such day from his ashram, the Sabarmati ashram in Ahmedabad, and he's going to march to a place on the sea. In that letter, he doesn't mention the name of Dandi. In fact, this idea that Dandi would be the village, the hamlet where Gandhi would eventually arrive, this is a decision that is taken much later on. But everything else that Gandhi mentions about his plans and everything worked out exactly as he had described. And so he says that he's going to break the salt law. The British had a monopoly on the manufacturing, production, distribution, sale of salt, and they derived a considerable amount of revenue from the salt law. And more importantly, this was an extremely onerous burden. The tax on salt was an extremely onerous burden because it was a tax that every Indian was paying, including the poorest Indian. And we know just how deep were the levels of immiseration, the levels of deep poverty in India at that time. So, in this letter, other than that, he then sets out to describe that the British are presiding over a system of administration of a country which has, in fact, essentially depleted the resources of India, that they have essentially robbed and looted India. And one of the more interesting aspects of this letter is the fact that Gandhi actually says that, look, it pains me to take a personal example here, but I'm going to do so, and I'm going to do so purely for the sake of illustration and not because I intend any personal harm to you or I wish you any ill will, because it's simply not in the nature of my way of thinking to have any ill will towards any person at all. And what is this personal example that he takes? He says in his letter to the Viceroy that let's take a look at what happens in Britain, where he says, all right, this is the salary, the average salary of a British worker, and this is the salary of the British Prime Minister. And the British Prime Minister makes, if I recall correctly, again, I haven't read the speech very recently, I haven't read the letter very recently, but this is from memory. I think he says that the salary of the British Prime Minister is about 90 times the salary of an average English worker. And then he says, now let's turn our attention to India, where he says, it pains me to tell you that your salary is 5,500 times the salary of an average Indian worker. And he adds this wonderful little touch where and it's not because he's being kind of mocking, but he's really saying it from a sense of almost from a sense of being charitable to the opponent, where he says that, look, I mean, I'm sure you don't need the kind of salary that you get, and I'm sure that a good portion of your salary actually goes towards charity, right? So he adds this little touch there, but then he says, on bended knee, I ask you, on bended knee, I ask you, right, to ponder over everything I've said and think about whether the system of administration in this country can possibly do even the remotest kind of justice to an Indian. You're presiding over what is one of the most inequitable systems of administration and rule in the history of the world. And he says, I'm going to now signal my defiance to British rule, because I cannot in fact tolerate this idea of British rule in India anymore. And in fact, he takes a pledge that he's not going to return to the ashram, because the Dandi march is going to be a march that's going to commence from the ashram, Sabarmati ashram in Ahmedabad, take him to Dandi, which is 241 miles, approximately 390 kilometers. And he says that I'm not going to return to the ashram until India has achieved Swaraj, right? And he never did it. He never did return to the ashram. And that's another story. Important thing here is he says to the Viceroy that either you attend to the grievances that I've laid down, or be prepared to have me march to the sea. I'm letting you know beforehand, you have it within your power to arrest me. This is how the game is going to play out. Right? So then, of course, the march does commence, and finally Gandhi arrives at Dandi in a complimentary video, which is a video that looks at a place called the Prarthana Mandir at Dandi, where Gandhi had arrived on the evening of April 5th, and where he gave a little discourse, as he did every evening when they stopped at a village or a place along the way. Right? So that's a complimentary video. In this mural here, what we see are the events of April 6th, 1930, the early morning. As I said, about 6:05 a.m. One of the persons accompanying him here is Sarojini Naidu. That's one of the two women alongside Gandhi. The other woman is Mitu Ben Petit. So she is an important player in the history of Gujarat and the non-cooperation movement and the history of social work. There's Chagan Lal Joshi. Who were the marchers? We're going to discuss that in another complimentary video when we get to another portion of the memorial, where we see statues of all the marchers. But it is said that when Gandhi actually broke the salt law here, Sarojini Naidu said to him, Babu, you have broken the salt law. And Gandhi is reportedly to have said, yes, I have broken the law, I am now a criminal. Right? I have broken the salt law. Right? And what is, of course, astonishing is the manner in which this simple act of defiance would reverberate, resonate around the world. Gandhi had become a person of global importance already by the early 1920s, when in 1919 he first initiated the Rowlatt Satyagraha, and then in the following year he launched the non-cooperation movement. 1920, early 1922, at that time Gandhi had started to become known around the world. He started receiving correspondence from people in the United States, and let's not forget that John Hayne Holmes, who was a preacher in New York, at his church, Riverside Church, he gave an address early 1921, if I recall, somewhere around 1921. The address was called "Who is the greatest man in the world today?" And people expected that he would probably say Lenin, you know, perhaps Woodrow Wilson. No. What Holmes says is, I'm going to point your attention to this relatively small brown-skinned man who lives in India and whose name is Mohandas Gandhi. So this should indicate to us that Gandhi was already becoming, as I said, known globally. The Salt March, the Dandi March, makes him into unquestionably a world historical figure. Newspapers and journals around the world would cover every aspect of his life hereafter. Gandhi had never, of course, believed in a private life, but henceforth it would become impossible for him in any case to have a private life, because he was now under the gaze everywhere in the world, right? And in India itself, the Salt March would encourage people to break the law everywhere. And what did it mean to break the law? That you wade into the sea water, right? And you essentially take the water, as it were, and eventually, of course, the water evaporates and it leaves a smattering of salt. And of course, what you're going to find, I mean, there could be lots of photographs, including some at the museum, which is part of this complex, where you see people who brought in salt water and then they put it on a pan and they light the pan, of course, and then eventually over a period of time the water evaporates and it leaves behind some salt. And it is said that before he arrived at Dandi, at the beach, at the creek, literally the creek, that creek now is where you have another monument which is part of this complex, that before he arrived there, on the evening before and the days before, what the British had done in order to try to obstruct him is that they had basically tried to bring in mud here and to mix it all up. And what you see here is, you see the figures of some of the marchers, some of the satyagrahis, some of the volunteers, because of course by this time it wasn't only the 80 marchers and Gandhi who were at the beach. There were thousands of people who were going to gather. And what you see, some of these people who are bending there amidst the mud, they are also looking for the salt, right? And isn't it astonishing? Shouldn't we really marvel at the fact that this, as I said, simple act of defiance is going to, in fact, lead eventually to the end of British rule. Now, let me say something about that, because the critics will say, well, we didn't get independence until 1947, until 17 years later. So evidently the march was not a success, right? That will be the argument. Nor was the salt tax abolished. It is also necessary to say that even in independent India, a salt tax was retained. And it was retained partly, of course, the argument was that we're going to actually retain this in order to use that tax to try to do more research on salt, to find out ways in which we can actually increase salt production, the manufacturing of salt, right? And the taxation rate certainly went down considerably, even though the salt tax was retained, right? But I don't think we can measure the success by simply saying that India didn't acquire independence in 1947. And before I give a brief assessment with which I conclude this talk of how we are to think about the Salt March, I want to say a word about this idea of success. This is not part of the language of Mohandas Gandhi, much as really the language of victory and defeat is not part of the language that Mahatma Gandhi deployed. Gandhi was fundamentally interested in the social transformation of humankind. He's fundamentally committed to the idea that we can have the transformation of individuals and societies, and it's best accomplished through a commitment to the ideas of Satya and Ahimsa and a complementary set of ideas, including things such as Swadeshi, self-reliance, Sarvodaya, welfare of all, right? Tapasya, discipline, sacrifice, brahmacharya, celibacy, and so on. There is a whole grammar of Gandhian thought, a vocabulary of Gandhian thought that we have to think about. But let's think about what is happening here. One of the things that happens in the wake of this is there are going to be 100, 200, 300,000 people who are going to be arrested over the coming weeks. The jails are going to be full. That sounds like large numbers, but let's not forget it's still a minuscule portion of the entire population of India. Right? But nevertheless, what is most important here is that in the wake of this, the British decided that they were going to hold a series of conferences which are now known as the Round Table Conferences. And it is the first time that the British actually sat down to negotiate with the Indians. The person who realized very well that the Salt March and what happened in its wake signaled the end, the eventual end of British rule, the person who realized that best of all was a man who always positioned himself as Gandhi's inveterate foe and opponent. A man who positively loathed Mohandas Gandhi, and here I'm referring to Winston Churchill. Because when Gandhi walks up the steps of the palace of the King Emperor in London, when he's there for the Round Table Conference, Churchill said, in words that now are known to every scholar of Gandhi and perhaps a few people beyond that, that the sight of a half-naked fakir of a type well known in the East walking up the steps of the palace to parley, to converse, to speak, to parley on equal terms with the King Emperor, and in this case with the representative of the King Emperor too, the Viceroy, right, for the negotiations. He said the sight of this was nauseating and disgusting to him. There could not be a more nauseating spectacle. Why? Because the supposition that someone like Gandhi had brought the British to their knees in some sense was something that Churchill couldn't tolerate. But the really larger ambit, the last remark here, the larger ambit within which we wish to consider the Salt March is to think really of the ways in which Gandhi was seeking to bring the idea of non-violence into the fabric of everyday life in India. The fabric of everyday life in India. That's what he was really seeking to do. And that is why those, evenings where he was actually having a discourse with the villagers every evening on subjects of Hindu-Muslim unity, on the welfare of Dalits, on the abolition of untouchability, on the problems of alcohol, on the uplift of village life, on the necessity of the improvement of women's lives, all of these issues. This is part of this history, the story of the social transformation of people and societies through nonviolence. And this, in the last analysis, is what the Dandi March is about. It's not only about trying to bring an end to political rule, because Gandhi understood very well, and he said this repeatedly in the last days of his life: we have achieved political independence, we have achieved political self-determination, but in addition to political rights, there are social rights, cultural rights, economic rights, and these are far harder to achieve. And I think it's in that context that we need to understand what happened at Dandi. And perhaps it's not an accident that it all played out over something called salt, which is, of course, an economic commodity. It is a cultural commodity in many ways. Think of all the aphorisms in the English language where we use the word salt, right? And from this idea of a political right, by expanding the various registers in which we think about salt, we actually also arrive at an understanding of what the march to the sea at Dandi really meant.